Hello, in this video, we're going to be talking about vertebrae. Let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now, when we're talking vertebrae, one of the first things we want to make sure that we emphasize is that the individual sections and their functions and the number of vertebrae within those sections. And so that's going to kind of be our focal point. And just like in the previous ones with the anatomy and the bones, a lot of names and a lot of locations to understand, not a lot of concepts or principles and things like that. So it'll be more about you collecting all the notes and understanding those. I shouldn't say understanding, but collecting the notes and having those ready for test material, test times, and less about so much what I say. And there's just not a lot to talk about other than just here's where they are and here's their name and here's what they do, which will all be on the screen in some manner. But this is certainly a section of the body that's pretty important to me as an older person. The vertebrae, I mean, it makes up a big portion of kind of my mental health mindset every day, just the way it feels, and back issues and sciatic nerve and stuff like that. So it's a pretty important one to me. Between the chiropractor visits and making sure I have proper support when I'm sitting and things like that. What little I do sit, and you guys see me enough. Matter of fact, when you see me here, this is probably the most you ever see me sit is sitting in a chair like this. But anyway, not something I do a bunch of. But anyway, it's a pretty important one. And from a health standpoint, certainly a lot of careers, chiropractors and things like that are all about making sure the back is in good shape. But as you can see, we've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections, and of course the last two are kind of tricky, the sacrum and the coccyx, because they don't look like individual sections or they don't have individual parts, but they do. They're just kind of more fused together than the other vertebrae, and certainly no cartilage or anything in between the sections, the sacrum and the coccyx or the coccygeal. You'll see both of those kind of words, but we'll go through each of them and talk about them. Okay, here's some more general information about them. You can see the length there, and a little bit about sounds that you hear, like when you're getting your back popped, or you turn your neck, or you get your neck popped, whatever. Those sounds that you're hearing, I mean, the logical thing to be thinking that they are the bones clicking or whatever, and that's not true, because if you think about that, if your bones were clicking each time over a long period of time, a lifetime, that interaction, that scraping together would wear on those and wear those out. What you're really hearing is gases being kind of pressed out, popped out, kind of like if you took a sandwich bag or some kind of a bag and blew it up and then popped it. That's kind of what you're hearing, just obviously not as loud. But it's certainly a noticeable feeling when you get your back pop. I know when I go get my adjustments at the chiropractor, I mean, it's a noticeable sound and a noticeable relief and pressure and tension in between the disc and stuff. And that's something we'll also talk about, herniated disc and disc issues and problems, things like that, as we go through our video. But you can see we do have 5 separate groups. Excuse me. 5 separate groups that we'll be talking about: the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and of course I already mentioned the sacrum and the coccygeal. In each of their important components, the numbers, you certainly want to know those numbers. and those are easy to memorize: 7, 12, 5, 5, 4. To think about those as far as how many vertebrae are in each group, and of course the differences that we'll be going through in size based on are they load bearing or not. As you get further down the vertebrae, once you get into the lumbar, and of course the sacrum is a very heavy, thick, strong plate that does a lot of things. And we'll talk about how you can palpitate them or feel them, and kind of where they are, and as far as feeling certain prominent bumps on the back of your neck, or lower head, lower skull, or along your back. Talking about kind of the major landmarks is probably the best way of saying that about the vertebrae. But certainly those numbers 7, 12, 5, 5, 4, you'll want to remember. Those are easy test questions, as you can imagine. So just be sure you work on that. But again, in lab settings, I know in the first couple of units, the lab settings weren't very prominent because there just wasn't anything really as far as models or to put your hands on. But once we get into the bones and muscles, that changes drastically because we will have those things in our hand with the idea of really understanding the parts and the feel, the look, and of course what their names are and their functions. Okay, some other things, general information about the vertebrae. I should have mentioned this up front. This video 1, vertebrae 1, is more about just the overall general information, and vertebrae 2 will be about the individual sections. But the next thing to think about is just the way the vertebrae is kind of shaped in the kind of that S formation, and not S as if you were turn somebody around and looked at their back. That wouldn't be an S. That would be a vertebrae that was out of alignment of some sort. And when we look at disorders, which we'll do here in a few screens, we'll see that. But we're talking an S, like you can see in the image. If you're looking from the side, that kind of just that gentle S shape, not a huge S shape. You wouldn't want to, if the end of your thoracic was deeply graded into the lumbar, that would create issues because then the load bearing wouldn't be as efficient. But you can see just kind of that gentle S there, and some of that is in that particular position right off the bat. Others are developed through your actions. Like for example, you'll see it here, the cervical gets its S shape when as a baby you start lifting your head up, you develop that S shape, and then the lumbar kind of it's part of the S. As you begin to walk upright and do more things, and it becomes more of a load bearing, that kind of designs that forms kind of with action, and of course the thoracic aspect, that it's S shaped, is developed because of the structure of the body. And I guess the question would be, could you visualize what part of your body creates the outward kind of S shape of the thoracic curvature? I'll pause here dramatically as I just kind of count in my head. 10, 11. Yeah, it's hopefully you yelled out the thoracic cage, the rib cage is what, because it has to be developed around that. So it kind of molds that outward S-shaped part of that as far as this, as its purpose or function. Okay, then when we look at, and there's the note that I mentioned about the lifting of the head, but it's part of it. So part of it is developed through action and use, and part of it is developed just the way it's structured initially. All right, looking at some abnormal curvatures. As you can see here on the diagram beside me on the far left is the normal look, and the big three. Scoliosis is probably the most prominent, and I don't know, it's been a while since, well, it's certainly been a long time since I had my own child. Someone think about that. I mean, Patrick is, well, I guess Leah would be the youngest, so she's, mid-20s and own family. And so if you think about that upper elementary, middle school age, when people really start looking at that stuff, that's been a while for me. So I don't know if it's still a thing or not, but scoliosis when I was a kid or in middle school, way back in the dark ages, certainly not even this century, that was a big thing. And the checking for that and the physical therapy kind of things they would give you to do to kind of maybe help with that, to strengthen that, or at least to make what changes you could just through kind of stretching and exercise and things like that. But scoliosis would be the most common. But the other two, as we will see, kyphus and lordosis, and a lot of these are either situational based, as in the lordosis, pregnancy or obesity, but then the kyphus can be kind of dealt with out of action, or an injury could cause it as well. But so those are kind of the other two main ones. There are others, but those three are the most prominent ones you hear or see about. Okay, now thinking about some structure stuff, and these are going to be these topics are going to be really handled and covered not only here in this video and in video 2, Vertebrae 2, but when we're putting our hands on the vertebrae. We've got a couple of ways in the lab that we will look at these. We've got just a set of individual vertebrae that we'll look at, and we've got a set that you can actually take a Bunsen burner clamp and put them on and build those. It's kind of a little puzzle. Can you kind of put them in order, because they are based on size and shape. It is pretty noticeable. It's what order they would go into from bottom to top, top to bottom, however you want to think about that. And of course, we've got a couple of rib cages. No, I shouldn't say rib cages, vertebrae that you can look at. And of course, we've got some models that you will also be looking at to kind of see the difference and understand the difference. With the purpose of, if we just put a picture of a vertebrae, either on a test or quiz or on the screen, or handed you one, you could say, you may not be, it wouldn't be so important you say the number, but certainly you'd be able to say, okay, that's cervical, that's thoracic, that's lumbar, one of those three would be the idea. But the overall general structure of them, the body of them, which is a part, as you can see in the diagram over on the far right, is the big circled area, or not circled, I mean the right word, oblong area, and that's things that you can find, or I should say things you can find in there. That's kind of where the bone marrow is as it develops into the bone structure. But other prominent areas is the foramens. You can see the big circle in the middle, and that's super important, because that's where everything that needs to be a resource for the individual vertebrae can be found. And that's also where the nerves would come out as it goes up and down from the brain. They would come out from there and then make their way to wherever they needed to go to. But the processes, they're both on the two on the side, and the spinosis process on the top. Based on which one it is, obviously the thickness of it would change. And of course, the cervical ones are mostly forked as well, and you can kind of feel that. That we'll talk about that when we get into the cervical, but you can kind of feel that all those little ridges that you feel along the back and back of the neck and the back. Those are the spinosis processes that you're feeling. So those would be some things that we talk about, but some other structural things to mention. Just mentioned the spinosis process, but the faucets of the articulars are super important because they are cartilage based, and you can kind of see them, the little whitish bluish thing, kind of in the middle of the diagram at the top, the one on the left, one on the right, almost like for people that wear glasses like myself that have those little nose pieces where there's a little padding on those, or they are padding. These particular ones don't have them, but it wouldn't have to look far to kind of see a pair. Oh, here's the pair. So if you kind of look at these, let me open these up here a little bit. These little nose pieces here, that's what the faucets are similar to give a little protection and cushion as it's up against something. And I think that's all for that one. So let's look at the next screen. All right, so when we think about the vertebrae disc, and when you hear that term herniated disc or ruptured disc, you think vertebrae, but it isn't the actual bone part. It's the cartilage or cartilage in between the two. If you know, and when you hear the word ruptured or herniated, it means it really means it's just torn. Okay, and it's no longer completely between the bone areas, which would be very, very painful, as you can imagine. One way to mentally think about it is, and this isn't really something that is common knowledge, but if you know what gaskets are on vehicles, especially in the engine, the head gasket and gaskets between individual parts, when they tear and they're no longer get that perfect seal, it allows things like oil or some of the combustible gases to escape. But just let things out, and it just doesn't set the way it needs to, and they certainly need to be repaired, and because of where they are, usually pretty costly repairs because of how much work has to be done. But that's what we're thinking about. It's a tear in that, and it can possibly repair itself over time, or it just has to be surgically repaired. But pretty painful, and those kind of things. So some other general things to think about. The disc, kind of their function, of course, obviously to absorb shock and to keep the bones from rubbing together, as you can imagine, which again would be, as I mentioned already, pretty painful. And of course, the last one is between the last lumbar L5 and the sacrum. And of course, I've already mentioned that the sacrum and the coccyx doesn't have any of those because they're basically, for the most part, fused together pretty tightly, and you couldn't have one in there anyway. Well, that's our video over general information for the vertebrae. So the next time we see each other, we'll be talking about vertebrae 2 and each of the individual sections. So we'll see you then.